There are actually two types of material instances in Unreal: constant and dynamic. Constant material instances, as we've seen, are a great way to tweak materials without needing to recompile the material after every change, and they greatly improve the workflow. Dynamic material instances allow us to tweak those same materials at runtime, where the viewer can see the changes based upon whatever interactive events we choose. A great example is allowing the viewer to alter materials in the scene, such as changing floor material types, paint colors, etc. Let's look at how we can go about using dynamic material instances. We'll go into the Content browser and go into the Actors folder, and from here we have a blueprint that I've created called BP_shader_ball. Let's go ahead and drag that into the scene. Now right now this shader ball is pretty much just like the other shader balls here, except this one is an actor and it has the ability to have blueprints attached to it. Let's go ahead and open it up now. We're going to use the event graph to create our functionality. So we'll click on that. And from here, the only node that we really need is event begin play. If you have any other nodes in your event graph, go ahead and delete those now. The first thing we need to be able to do to control a material instance dynamically at runtime is to create what's called a create dynamic material instance node. So we'll right-click in the event graph and do a search for create dynamic and material instance. We want the one on the bottom here that has shader ball in parentheses. This will now allow us to modify the material instance for our shader ball. But before we can do so, we need to specify the source material in the drop-down here. So we'll do a search for mi_master material, and we'll use the first one here. Now we're going to control the texture as well as the metallic value and the color value that it multiplies the texture by. For the texture and the metallic value, we're just going to change those at runtime as soon as the asset is loaded up. But for the color value, we're going to allow the viewer to click on the object and randomly change the color value. So to do that, let's go ahead and use three of the other nodes we have available to us here in Blueprint. The first one we're going to use is set texture parameter value. For this, we'll pull off of the return value output here and do a search for set texture parameter value. We're going to use the parameter that is specified in the material instance for our diffuse texture. And if you recall, that value is diffuse. For the value, we could pipe in a texture here, but instead we're just going to use the drop-down, and I'm going to do a search for fireplace, and we'll use this fireplace rock diffuse texture. Next up, we're going to control the metallic value, so I'm going to pull off of the return value here again to get a reference to the material instance. And when we pull off of that, we need to do a search for set scalar parameter value. We're going to set the parameter name here to metallic, which, as you recall, that's the name of our parameter in the material instance. Again, we could pipe the value in here using some other Blueprint functionality, but for this case, we're just going to set it to a value of 1 when the asset is first created, when the scene begins playing. Speaking of which, let's pull off of the event begin plays output and pipe that into the execution flow for our create dynamic material instance. All right, so we have one more thing to create, and that is our vector parameter, which is going to control the color. So for this, we're going to again pull off of the return value, and we'll do a search for set vector parameter value. And for the parameter name, that is going to simply be color, which is what we specified in our material instance. Now for this, we're not going to execute this following the creation of the material instance. Instead, we're going to control this by allowing the viewer to click on the object in the viewport. For this, we're going to first need two things added to our blueprint here. One is going to be a variable, which will hold the color value. Another one's going to be an event dispatcher. Event dispatchers allow us to send and receive events from one object to another. So let's start out with our variable for the color here. We're going to go to variables under our blueprint panel here. Click the plus button to add one. We'll call this variable color. And under details, we'll change the variable type to a vector so it can hold our 3 values for color and drag that into the event graph. We want to set the color, and then we're going to pipe this execution flow into the set vector parameter value, and our result here, we're going to pipe that into the value here. We can see it's automatically converted the vector result into the input value expected for set vector parameter value. Next up, we need our event dispatcher, which we can then call from the level blueprint. For this, we'll go to the event dispatcher section here, click the plus button to create a new one. We're going to call this one change color. Now with the event dispatcher selected, we're going to go to the details panel, and we need to add an input that can hold the color value that is sent to it. So we'll click this little plus button here next to the inputs rollout to add a new parameter, and we're going to call this color value, and we'll leave it as a vector. All right, and once we've added our input, let's go ahead and compile. And now we can drag the change color event dispatcher into the event graph. We want to choose event here. And now we can see our new event dispatcher event and the color value input. Let's go ahead and drag the execution flow out of our event into the input of our set vector here. And then we'll pull the color value into the input there. All right, that's all we need to do in here. Let's go ahead and save and compile this. And we're ready to move on to the level blueprint. Next up, we'll continue with our dynamic material instance where we build the level blueprint needed to communicate with our shader ball and randomly change the color.